Good day, everyone. I'm not sure what time zones everybody is in, so that's the safe way of saying it. I want to welcome all of you to our program, No Bread, No Peace, Food Security as Foreign Policy. My name is Jerry Green. I work at the Pacific Council on International Policy in Los Angeles, and we are honored and delighted to have with us Ambassador Ertharin Cousin and Linda Calhoun. This is the second program in our 2021 partnership, our Global Speaker Series, presented jointly. You say World Affairs in San Francisco. I always say, I need to say San Francisco World Affairs, so people in Los Angeles know that you are indeed where you are, and the Pacific Council on International Policy, and we're delighted to welcome you. I want to thank our partners, Philip Yan, Susie Antunian, and especially Carla Thorson, who's the program coordinator, for helping us to bring to life a very powerful partnership. When you put LA and San Francisco in the mix, we're suddenly talking about the state of California and not two remarkable cities. So it's doing our work together is important. I want to introduce our guests, but I would like to just say two sentences about food security. Food security goes far beyond, getting calories into people and nutrition and survival. It's even broader than that. Why should we care about climate change? Because of food security. Why should we care about food security? Because it affects education. Is this a domestic issue in the United States? Absolutely. What the pandemic has demonstrated graphically and with great cruelty, I would argue, is lines of people coming to pick up food because their lives have been so disrupted. Children, when they go to school, the best meal of the day they will have is when they attend school. So food security is a global issue. I'm not an expert, but I would not say that, the United States has it fixed and we're going to instruct everybody. Certainly there are areas we can instruct, but I think it's important for us to understand, and this is kind of a Pacific Council issue, we do not make a distinction between domestic and international issues. It is all the same. It is all the same. If we want to talk to the Chinese about Hong Kong or Myanmar or, pick an issue, we need to make sure we're doing the best we can in our country, and sadly, that's not always the case. So I just want you to understand that this is an issue that matters in downtown Los Angeles, and I'm certain in San Francisco as well. Ambassador Ertharin Cousin is a visiting scholar at the Center on Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University. She's also a distinguished fellow of global agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is our peer. It's our sibling. And Chicago, the Chicago Council is the leading authority on food security issues, I would argue, in the world. They have taken this issue on and they deal with it, really, really meaningfully and effectively. Ambassador Ertharin was the United States ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture in Rome from 2009 to 2012, which is an enormously important occupation and responsibility. We not only have ambassadors to countries, but to multilateral organizations that do remarkably important work. Subsequently, she served as executive director of the World Food Program from 2012 to 2017. And in this role, she led, and this is remarkable, the world's largest humanitarian organization, 14,000 staff serving 80 million vulnerable people across 75 countries. She is a leading expert on food security issues, and as I said at the outset in my own amateurish way, it is not merely about calories, it's about the human condition writ large. And we are honored and delighted to have her with us today. Moderating our conversation is Linda Calhoun, who is a former trustee of the World Affairs Council, for those of us in LA, of San Francisco. And she's the founder and executive producer of careergirls.org, which is a free, non-commercial online platform which showcases video clips of diverse women, role models sharing career and educational advice to inspire young girls to expand their horizons. And I hope after I withdraw from the scene, the video clip of this session today will be shared with your constituents, because this is exactly an example of the kind of things that are inspirational to so many of us. I now want to turn it over to Linda. I will see all of you at the end of the session. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank our speakers for taking the time to share their wisdom with us. And I want to thank our partners in San Francisco for being such great partners. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, Ambassador Cousin. Let's get straight to the foreign policy issues surrounding the topic of food security so that we can level set. Can you please bring us up to speed on the ongoing conflict in Yemen?
Well, with apologies for oversimplification, let me just start by saying that the conflict in Yemen, first of all, even before the conflict in Yemen, Yemen was one of the poorest countries on the globe, and with the highest nutrition rates, with some of the highest malnutrition rates across the globe. And it is and was the poorest country in the Middle East. In 2014, there was the overthrow of the government of Yemen by the Houthis. The government of President Hadi was overthrown by the Houthis, which was led by Ansar Allah, who is now the leader of the Houthis, running the country of Yemen. Saudi, with a coalition of partners, began a military campaign against the country in 2015, which has gone on until today. That military campaign has resulted in now 85% of the country requiring humanitarian assistance, 65% of the country required in need of food assistance in order to meet their food needs. 400,000 children today are suffering from acute malnutrition, which means that they are on the verge of starvation and death. Over 100,000 people have been killed, and the access to food outside of this humanitarian situation is limited because the price of food in markets has increased by almost 200%.
Wow. And so let's speak to some of the intentionality behind this in terms of how hunger is being used as a weapon of war. How are the warring parties engaging on this scale?
Well, there are conventions that govern conflict. And in those conventions and in the humanitarian principles, we all agree that access to meeting the life-saving needs of the population must be provided. That the government that is in control of the population has the first responsibility. If that government is unable to, the international community, they must provide the access for the international community to support the needs of that population. In any given month in Yemen today, a humanitarian working to provide support is met by what we call humanitarian checkpoints. checkpoints or different requirements that limit that humanitarian access. And what the humanitarian principles require is that access not be unreasonably withheld. That becomes a question. What is reasonable? And when a government knows that, and a party in a conflict is aware that their imposition of checkpoints or access obstacles will limit the ability of humanitarians to provide food assistance, to provide water to a population in need. That intentionality is when it becomes using the humanitarians as a weapon of war, because it becomes a political tool. We'll give you humanitarian access if. We'll give you humanitarian access when. But when those contingencies are put into operation, that transactional political decision making that results in 400,000 children living with the potential for death, that is when food is used as a weapon of war.
Thank you for that very disturbing picture of what's happening on the ground there in Yemen. And now that President Biden has shifted support away from Saudi Arabia, do you have any insights on what that shift means for Yemenis and their ability to meet basic needs?
I would not suggest that I have any firsthand insight into the diplomatic conversations between the Biden government, the Yemen government, and the Saudi government. But as an outsider, having had previous experience in these relationships, I would say that limiting the U.S. in participation in the conflict has the potential to bring the parties to the table to begin to negotiate. But it would be naive for me to suggest that it's simply bringing the Yemenis and the Saudis to the table. This is a larger conflict that also involves Iran as much as it has involved the US in the past. So the conversation will require all of the allies and to support the resolution of the conflict. And the opportunity for the US to serve as more of a diplomatic broker and leader in that conversation is greater when they are not providing access to weapons or support to one side of the conflict over the other.
That's great. And, speaking about sort of the diplomatic presence that's going to have to be involved, can you talk about some of the political actions that can address what's gone on with the deliberate starvation of people in conflict?
It's interesting when you say the political actions that go on. The political actions are directly related to the humanitarian actions. The ensuring that as part of the political conversation and not as a trading point, but as a requirement for progress in the political discussions, that humanitarian access becomes a priority, that it is not traded away or left for on the table for another day for discussion, that it must be a central pillar of any conversation that is regarding the political resolution of the issues in Yemen. And it is only when humanitarian response is elevated to that level of dialogue will the parties seriously begin to discuss what is necessary to ensure humanitarian access. But that also must include the parties committing to providing the financial support that is necessary to ensure that humanitarians not only have the access, but the tools that are necessary for them to meet the needs of the population affected by this conflict.
And so a body like the UN Security Council would need to elevate this issue and make sure the funding, or maybe even peacekeepers, would be sent to ensure access. And then also, I guess, looking to the International Criminal Court to hold parties responsible.
Well, when you raise it to that level, when it's beyond just the parties negotiating for the peace in Yemen, but also including the multilateral system in that conversation, then you're exactly right. We must have a Security Council that is in support of their own resolution from 2018, where they unanimously agreed that food and starvation must not be used as a weapon of war, that access must be given to ensure humanitarians have the ability to support those in need, to provide the leverage for the parties to perform pursuant to that resolution will require Security Council action. The parties are not going to do it on their own, and the Security Council must provide the space that is necessary for humanitarians to provide the access, to have the access that is required. And that is going to require, again, the U.S. now having the posture as a non-combatant, and now has the capacity to negotiate with the Russians and the Chinese to provide for the unanimous Security Council resolution and support for the type of activities that are necessary. And this, I am not suggesting that this is going to be an easy lift for the parties, but we are at a point where those on the ground, those affected by a campaign that has now gone on for almost 6 years, that they require this level of political will by the leaders of the global community, particularly those on the Security Council. You know, the U.S. has never embraced the International Court of Justice, but we have in the past, under previous administrations, supported the International Court of Justice, and the ICC has the ability, with the support again of leaders like the US, and we need Russia and China as well, to say that those who commit atrocities, mass atrocities, and that is what the making deliberate decisions that result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children, is the type of action where the the ICC should use their authority to bring the decision makers to justice, and as the only place in our global community that has voice for those who are the victims of that decision making.
And, you know, as you're talking about other parties to this, what are some of the broader implications of hunger and conflict in countries like Syria?
Well, the challenge of acute hunger in the world, we've made progress on hunger. I should say that there were prior to COVID, we were continuing to see a year-over-year decrease in the number of people who are hungry around the globe. The challenge is where there is acute conflict, where there is the impact of climate and acute economic upheaval, Venezuela being a good example of that, is where we see increases in and spikes in protracted hunger. And Syria is another example of a conflict that has now gone on for more than 10 years, where the population that is internally, and half the population is externally displaced, with another a significant portion of the population still externally displaced as a result of the ongoing conflict. But it's not limited to just Syria and Yemen. We see the same things in Somalia, and where conflict and climate are affecting the access to food for the most vulnerable population. South Sudan, where the conflict has come to an end, but the protracted nature of civil unrest in the country continues to affect the access to food for the most vulnerable population. Northeast Nigeria, Burkina Faso, where extremism, that we can see a direct link between the reduction in extremist activities in Syria, in Iraq, and an increase in extremist activities in West Africa, in Mali, Niger, Northeast Nigeria. In all of those areas, food security and acute food security, because of lack of access to food, because of instability in the population due to conflict, results in food insecurity, hunger, and an increase in malnutrition.
Thank you for bringing those different parts of the world in conflicts into view for us. One thing I'd like for our audience to understand is, the Arab Spring is said to have been food insecurity was part of the catalyst for the escalation of the protests. The Tunisian fruit seller, I believe his name was Mohamed Bouazizi, his self-immolation over not being able to sell his food really was sort of a domino in the Arab Spring. So I want people to understand how something that might seem minor, quote unquote, in some ways can really be the catalyst for tremendous change going forward. So
and as a visiting scholar at Stanford, one of the first things a Stanford student will tell you is that correlation is not causation. That is one of the things that you learn early on in your academic career. And while the drive, we often describe it with this metaphor, that the drive to conflict, their hunger is always in the car. It may not be driving the car, but it's in the car. and so there is a relationship, whether it is there's a direct causal relationship. Those who spend a significant amount of their research time focused on these issues are continue to debate that issue. But we know that there are implications for community stability directly related to agricultural productivity and food security of a population. We know that in Syria, that there was a drought prior to the Syrian conflict, that the response to that drought by the government and the impact that had on the rural population resulted in uprisings in the capital that ultimately went from uprisings to armed conflict that led to the Syrian conflict that we're in today. So that spark of unrest that you described was one that we saw ignite the demand by those in need for their government, and how the governments responded is directly related to how the level of conflict in particular areas, whether you're talking Tunisia or Egypt or even over to Syria.
Thank you. So now I'd like to, we talked about how starvation has been used as a weapon to advance conflict. Can you talk more about how food security can be used as a weapon against conflict?
You know, there's a growing body of data that suggests that those who are chronically hungry don't that they don't riot, that they don't protest, that protests occur when those who expect more can no longer afford bread, as in the situation you described, or with the high food price spikes that we saw in 2009 that resulted in riots in some 40-odd cities. And those riots were primarily led by students and workers who were day laborers or workers who had a lower income, but they were able to buy bread, and then they couldn't. So we know when there is stability in the market, when people can access food, when the governments are responsive to and providing the safety nets that are necessary to support the ability of those who cannot afford food to have the ability to access food, that those are pillars in stable communities. We also know that the data supports this, that when extremist groups seek to grow their presence in a particular area, one of the things they do is feed the population, is to provide access to food to those who otherwise wouldn't have it. And they use that as a recruitment tool, often for young boys whose families don't have access to enough food to eat, that they provide them with that food. And then they say, now you owe us because we are providing the food assistance to your families. So we know that as a tool to combat the spread of extremism, that investments in agricultural development and food security and providing those social safety net programs create the stability in communities and overcome the possibility of those communities being drawn into a conflict or being limit the appeal of extremism from those recruiters. As I said, these are areas where we as a development and humanitarian community are beginning to recognize that those types of investments make a difference. I would not suggest that we have a body of evidence available to support a direct causal relationship between if you feed them, there will not be conflict. But there is enough evidence to demonstrate that community stability does indeed limit conflict, does indeed limit extremism, and to make that investment viable and valid.
Thank you. You know, I'm going to invite questions from the audience, but while I see what folks want to query you about, can you talk about the domestic U.S. food insecurity problem? And specifically, what's the situation on the ground here
Mhm,
in the US?
mhm. Well, a recent analysis that's supported by Feeding America suggests that we now have about 52 million people in the United States post-COVID that are in need of food assistance, who are food insecure. And that's an increase of 17 million people from pre-pandemic levels. We also know that in the United States, we have a very effective but not very efficient food system, and that was all illuminated during COVID. We basically have two food systems in the United States. One which supports retail, which is based upon historical data of how customers shop, and that's how the buyers purchase food and stock shelves. So in the summertime in Chicago, you have certain produce on the shelves as opposed to what you have on the shelf in the wintertime. And those food systems have been very reliable. And as I said, they've been very productive, but not very efficient, because when that entire system closed at once, when we went on lockdown as a nation, you saw empty shelves, because there was no historical data and the systems were not in place to support the replenishment at retail that was necessary to meet the sudden demand by the entire US population to the entire US population's food needs at retail when we were all sheltered in place at home. On the other side of this, our other food system is the food system that supports large institutions, restaurants, hotels, universities, and how that food is packaged and processed is quite different than how it is packaged and processed and moved through the system for the retail. And so what we then witnessed with that system was large amounts of produce being plowed under. And we saw milk being poured out, because the milk as one of my colleagues shared with me, who's part of one of the dairy organizations, she said, Ertharin, my farmers produce cheese in 400-pound wheels. There's no place for us to send that if the system shut down. And so because we had this very, as I said, productive but not agile set of food systems, we saw failures in our own food system. The US captured much of that failure in that large institutional value chain through the farm to box program. And I'm delighted to see that in the recent bill that was passed by Congress yesterday, there's additional dollars in there for the farm to box program. In other words, purchasing from those farmers, giving them a market for their product, and that market being those hungry people that increased by 17 million people, by providing food boxes to community organizations for them to distribute to the hungry across America. And so now, while our systems are not back completely online, the support from the government, the increase in operations by the philanthropic sector has supported that large institutional supply chain and begun to provide more food assistance to hungry Americans across the country.
Thank you. I want to bring in a question from the audience. Can Ambassador Cousin address the impact of malnutrition on the health of civilian children and adults? So we've got the food insecurity, but access to nutrition as well.
Thank you for that question. And I should have talked about it, because when I started this work, and I'm old, decades ago, we were focused on kilocalories. How many kilocalories could we get to people to fill stomachs? But what we began to realize, particularly in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, that lack of access to the appropriate and adequate micronutrients would result in that child's being physically and mentally stunted for their entire life, that we could not replace we could not repair the damage that was the result of this lack of access to micronutrients. So it is so important that it is not just about the access to affordable food, but access to nutritious food, whether that food is provided by a humanitarian organization, domestically or international, or is purchased on our shelves. Every person must have access to affordable, nutritious food. And the other side of that coin, because nutrition is not about just undernutrition, it is also about overnutrition. And this is an issue that I would argue is an epidemic in the United States, and that is the epidemic of obesity. And we've seen the effect of that epidemic in the outcomes from COVID, the highest level of comorbidity with COVID is, as the physicians are now learning, is obesity and other diet-related diseases. And so the challenges of malnutrition are as detrimental as the challenges of lack of food to the body.
And thank you for that. Another question that we have is, what role do you think food can play in cross-community peace building actions?
Love that question. Oftentimes what we see, and this is more in post-conflict reconciliation activities, what you often find, particularly with bringing women together who were on opposite sides of the conflict, with food as the center point of those conversations that begin a dialogue around peace building and peace maintaining in communities, helping people recognize that through food that we have more in common than what separates us. I have a good friend who teaches food as diplomacy at Georgetown, recognizing that we can use our shared need for more knowledge about how to support a more sustainable food system to create dialogue amongst parties where dialogue would otherwise not exist. And this is a tool that is being deployed more, particularly at the local level, among populations by different peace negotiators and coaches.
And, you referenced the bill that was passed yesterday by the House. It seeks to, in some ways, address economic inequality. And can you speak to how that is an effective path to ensuring access to food and nutritious food? And in other actions that, individual citizens can advocate for to address this issue?
Well, let me start with the opportunity for providing access to more nutritious food through the legislation that was just passed is quite significant. There's money there for school meals, for grants to families to support access to school meals. There's increased money for food banks. There's money for increased money for SNAP recipients to ensure their access to more nutritious foods. Um, there's also money in the bill to support businesses. Part of the challenge that we have, particularly in our inner city Black communities, is the lack of the intergenerational poverty issue. And the lack of wealth building in these communities. An investment in the ability of entrepreneurs to start and grow businesses that can not only provide access to food in these communities, but also access to employment and to circulate money in the communities in a way that changes the opportunities for those in the community. Food and food businesses and agriculture businesses can provide that level of opportunity, and those investments that this bill supports will go a long way to catalyzing that work that is necessary. The question of what can individuals do to support this work is one that I absolutely love. We all live in a neighborhood, whether it's in a community, and we have organizations in our community that need our time and our treasure. And this is, it's one of the outcomes of COVID that continues to give me hope is the spirit of Americans in helping one another. But to recognize that your neighbor is not just the person you can see. We live on a very small planet. And what affects those you cannot see today has the potential to detrimentally affect you tomorrow. And also the potential to help us all rise to a better place. So not out of fear, but out of hope for a different world, that we as individuals invest in the organizations, the institutions, and the individuals that are working to make a difference, both in our local neighborhoods, as well as in our the national organizations, and in the global community.
And, you know, speaking of the global community, one of the audience members brought up a story that was done, I guess, in the New York Times about the impact of climate change on migratory patterns and, you know, the impact on permafrost and where food will be grown. You know, how can we better prepare for the impact that climate is going to have on our food security?
Big question. As a part of the Paris Climate Agreement, there was funds that the global governments committed to establishing for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. There's been very little money invested in those climate adaptation funds. And now in a post-COVID world, we are in these conversations with how do we build back better. All of these issues have the same answers. Requires the investments in agricultural development that supports the ability for us to grow more with less water, to reuse land that has been diminished by investing in the soils to support more productive agriculture from diminished soils. We cannot continue to just expand our agricultural area in order to support the food needs of those around the globe. We need to do better on the land that we are operating today. It it means sustainable agriculture. It requires investment in carbon capture and carbon sequestration of agricultural production that supports more diverse crops that can provide not only the food we need, support the soils in the way that we need, but reduce our carbon footprint from agriculture. It requires investment in livestock feed and production techniques that will reduce the methane emissions from our ongoing livestock industries. It requires us as consumers to reduce in the developed world, to reduce our consumption of red meats, while in other parts of the world we need an increase in animal protein. To address malnutrition. And so all of these issues are the issues that the United Nations Food System Summit, as we speak, are working to develop game-changing ideas to introduce to the entire global community in September of this year at the UN Food System Summit, where the global leaders will come together, much as they did for the climate summit, to embrace the how do we go forward. And those commitments, I am hopeful, will not just be commitments that we make at an international summit, but that we as a global community of leaders, and I'm so pleased the US is leading again in this conversation, that we will invest both, again, the capital, the financial capital, as well as the human resources and technical capacity is necessary to drive those types of changes globally.
You know, it's been absolutely fascinating and so illuminating for us, Ambassador Cousin, to get your perspectives on all these issues. And I realize, we didn't get into a long examination of your biography, but, you have concentrated your career on food issues. And I was just wondering for our audience, if you could just sort of walk us through that career path. It's been domestic, international, corporate. So
very quick version of
okay.
The Ertharin journey. It is not a journey that I planned. What I knew from the very beginning was that what I did with my career, I wanted to make a difference in more than my life, but in the lives of others. And at the time when I started my career, I thought it was simply in the lives of Chicagoans and African Americans by using my law degree at that point to support access to legal services for those in Chicago's South and West sides. And Linda, from having lived in Chicago, those are some of the toughest communities in America. But I very quickly realized that many of the problems that people came to me with were manifesting themselves as legal problems, but they were economic problems, educational problems, food access and nutrition problems, housing problems. And so if I wanted to make a difference, I needed to use that law degree in other ways. And that's what throughout my career, I've been blessed with the opportunity to do, whether it was through government, where I served as an assistant attorney general, head of our ethics board, or working as the White House liaison at the State Department, and so government I've worked in every level of government, from local all the way through federal government. But it was also private sector. I've had the opportunity to serve in the retail food industry in a variety of different roles through the Albertsons company, where my last position with them was as Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Communication, and where I helped build stores in urban areas across America, where people said in areas that were otherwise designated as food deserts, and help build stores, many of them that are still open today, 15 years later, serving nutritious food to communities across the country. It was public sector, private sector. I went from there I learned very quickly. I enjoyed the fruits of private sector, but the opportunity to make a difference in a broader way was given to me to become the executive vice president of what is now Feeding America. And I led in that organization during the Hurricane Katrina, which was one of the largest humanitarian crises that we've ever seen in this country, that resulted in an impact on people's ability to feed themselves. And we were feeding people and if you recall, Katrina didn't just affect New Orleans, it was Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas. I decided after that I was going to start a business doing public-private partnerships to get public sector and private sector to work together to support what was necessary to ensure that Americans had access to nutritious food. At that same time, this guy named Barack Obama decided that he was going to run for president. He said, "If I run, will you help me?" And I said, "I'm in." And I became his senior advisor on his campaign. I was probably the fifth or sixth person hired on his campaign. And we won, and he became president. And when I was asked what I wanted to do, I said, I want to take this work that I've been doing and become the U.S. ambassador. And he said, why not? And so he nominated me. The Senate confirmed me. And your senator, I will never forget, I was introduced by Senator Durbin at my hearing, my confirmation hearing. Your senator, then Barbara Boxer, was chairing the committee. And she looked down and she said, they finally sent us somebody who was qualified for this job. It was a great moment in my career. And I became the U.S. ambassador for food and agriculture. And I was in the multilateral sphere with the World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. I was the U.S. representative. I was also the U.S. representative for all of the investments that we were making in development projects around the globe, where I would take media to see what the U.S. was investing in and where we were prioritizing our investments to support agricultural productivity and peace and security in those countries. After that, the opportunity was given to me by the Secretary General of the United Nations to serve as the Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program. And you heard in the introduction what the World Food Program does. But what most people don't know is that in addition to being the largest humanitarian organization providing food, the World Food Program is also the logistics organization for the entire humanitarian community. So the trains, planes, buses that move both the people and the equipment that's necessary to meet the humanitarian needs during times of crisis, the World Food Program provides that work as well, including standing up the telecommunication systems for the humanitarian response during crisis and conflicts. So after completing that work, Stanford gifted me a distinguished fellowship and allowed me to spend 2 years there doing the research that's led to the development of food systems for the future. Basically, our theory of change is that if we invest in businesses in that messy middle that will provide access to nutritious foods for underserved populations, we can impact nutrition outcomes and provide a market-based return. And so we stood up that organization in November of 2019, standing up a new organization right before COVID starts. That was interesting. But it's been a great ride, and we continue to perform the work. And as you can hear, there's a direct line in all of my work. While it has not been linear, my commitment to making change, to changing lives, to providing support to those in need, to ensuring that we go beyond putting Band-Aids on problems to helping people solve their own problems, to providing opportunity, is very much what my career has been all about.
Thank you for that. I love how you've been able to act both locally and globally on an issue that is so important and that you're so passionate about. Any advice that you could share to a young person, anybody watching this video on, how they can get started to work on issues like these right where they are right now?
Volunteer where you are right now. I work with Stanford students on a daily basis who they come to me with an idea. I say, great idea, go do it. What can I do to help you? And that's what I believe in, because when you are a young person, you believe you can make change, and so go with it. We too often become our own worst enemies, and we allow our fear of trying to limit our ability to do. And so, as a young person with an idea, with a passion, with a desire to make a difference, just do. And you will find that that when you invest your intellectual capital in the areas where you are most passionate, not only will you be probably more successful, but those are the places where you will really make a difference.
We're at the point where this is the last question I can ask you before we close. Fighting hunger is a heavy subject. Can you tell us what gives you hope in addressing these issues?
The two things that give me hope. One, when I talk to mothers around the world and they are doing everything in their power to ensure their children have a life of opportunity and prosperity, and that they're fed, and that that they're nourished. And that I've been in some of the toughest places in the world with fat, healthy babies, because the right investments are made, the support that is necessary to access food is provided, and the people are given the ability to live their lives to their full potential. That gives me hope that we know what is necessary to make the changes that will provide for more of those fat, healthy babies. And the second thing that gives me hope is, Linda, people like you who are willing to who are willing to interview me, to have this type of conversation with an audience that doesn't know Ertharin Cousin, but is interested in these issues and knowing more and being involved and wanting to make a difference. As long as we have people who are interested and were willing to use their desire, their own public will, their thoughts, their ideas, their compassion, their time, their treasure, we will ensure that people no longer go hungry and have access to the nutritious food that is necessary.
Thank you, Ambassador Cousin. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. And thank you very much. And Jerry, if you want to come back in and join us, it's really been a wonderful opportunity to hear from an expert of your caliber about this important issue.
Thank you.
I want to thank you both. It's hard to imagine something being incredibly sobering, depressing, and inspirational at the same time. I mean, that sounds like the ultimate oxymoron. It's so internally contradictory, but I think you've both hit both ends of the spectrum. President Bashar al-Assad in Syria was interviewed on television, or is it a press conference? And he was asked about the food crisis in Syria. And Assad is a physician. So one thinks that physicians, care about the human condition. And his response is, yeah, I know about it. I think we should no longer have cooking programs on television so that our people will not, know what they're missing. I mean, this was his solution to this devastating problem. So this is really very, very serious. And I really appreciate your bringing it home to the United States as well, that this is an issue for us along with the rest of the world. I want to thank you again for joining us. I want to thank our audience, San Franciscans, Angelinos. I want to invite all of you. I hope to see you at our next Pacific Council World Affairs Global Speakers Forum. We'll be having a conversation with Gilles Capel, who is the leading scholar in Europe on Islam. And France has not dealt with Islam particularly easily. So this is an ongoing challenge. I wish all of you a healthy and happy, good weekend, and get vaccinated and get healthy. And I'm going to keep talking about fat, healthy babies now. The grandfather, that term "fat, healthy babies" really
There you go.
resonated with me. So my thanks to you both and to
Thank
our
you.
audience and our friends in San Francisco. This ends our session today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.